Welcome to presentation number 8 on the Federalist era. I know you have missed these desperately over fall break and have wanted to get back into listening to my wonderful voice on the computer. So let's get started on chapter 8, shall we? Home to almost 4 million people and stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico to the eastern seaboard to the Mississippi River, the United States was experiencing economic and demographic growth on a large scale during this era. The differences between the agrarian society in the South and the shipping-focused North continued to increase. The South was agricultural focused, on cash crops and big plantations with cities spread farther apart. The North had more factories, industry. The cities were closer together, and as the nation grew, these differences continued to separate the interests of the two regions. As the first president of the United States, and under the new Constitution, George Washington appreciated the delicate position he was in, that everything he did would set a precedent for future presidents. In order to fulfill his role as chief executive, Washington established his cabinet, which was composed of the leaders of the executive departments. The Department of State, responsible for diplomatic relations with the other countries, and the first secretary was Thomas Jefferson. The Department of Treasury is over the United States finances and was first overseen by Alexander Hamilton. Department of Justice is the main legal advisor and the Attorney General, when Edmund Randolph was the first to hold that position. The Supreme Court was the only court created by the Constitution, and the only member specifically mentioned was the presiding officer, the Chief Justice. Congress was given the authority to create as many levels of jurisdiction of courts and justices and judges as it deemed necessary. And John Jay, the negotiator of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, with peace with Britain, was named the first Chief Justice. To calm fears about an overbearing national government, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to ensure the rights of citizens and states in the new government. It was ratified in 1791. When the Constitution was ratified, the United States was the only nation in the world that did not in some form sponsor a religion or mandate some form of religion requirement to hold office. In the First Amendment, Congress was forbidden from endorsing a religion or preventing others from worshiping as they saw fit. Our nation was founded on the principles of religion, just not founded on the principles of a single religion. It was founded on the principles and the ideas of religious freedom. This drawing below was published in Philadelphia in 1790. In it, America is depicted as a woman laying down a shield to instead engage in the arts, education, commerce, and agriculture, getting ready to stop being at war for a while and ready to establish its own cultural identity. A decorated Revolutionary War hero, Alexander Hamilton always wanted more and had learned how to fight for what he wanted through a difficult upbringing in the West Indies. Originally, the only method Congress had of raising money was by placing taxes on imports. This is known as a tariff. Taxing of an individual's income was extended in the 20th century in the form of the 16th Amendment. And Alexander Hamilton, a man who had, quote, pulled himself up by his bootstraps, was a firm believer in a national economic policy that would strengthen the role of the central government while enriching the national economy. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton won approval to absorb all of the states' individual wartime debts, along with that of the national government, consolidating them into one big debt, paying them all off as one. While the Constitution does not establish or delegate power for a national bank, he fought for the establishment of a bank, although the lines of the Bank of England helped the economy of the United States and helped to improve national credit rating for the new nation. He also wanted to implement protective tariffs to build up the new nation's industries and establish a public credit system. The downside of Hamilton's plan was that it would strengthen the hand of the northern shippers and merchants in the government over that of the agrarian South. His plan would be the first to illustrate the sectional differences in the nation between North and South. It also strengthened the federal arm of the national government by giving it control over the country's money. After winning the debt payment debate, Hamilton moved to his vision of a national bank to control the monetary supply. His idea was a centralized banking authority that would allow the government to prevent the inflation or deflation of the dollar. However, the power to create a bank was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, and the debate that emerged was the first great debate on the constitutional interpretation to be heard in Congress. In the end, the bank was approved. Hamilton's greatest achievements were paying off the national war debt, the growth of U.S. manufacturing, and the establishment of international United States credit. Although successful, the heavy-handed manner and what some viewed as unconstitutional actions of Hamilton to secure the national bank and to pay off the war debts led to the creation of the first political parties. Hamilton and his followers formed the Federalist Party, which promoted a strong central government. And these formation of parties led to the big questions of the time. There's still the big questions of today when it comes to discussing the Constitution. And those questions are this: should there be a strict or a broad construction of the Constitution? Were the powers of Congress only those explicitly stated in the document, or were others implied? This debate still actually rages today on those exact same issues. Jefferson and Madison, on the other hand, formed the Republicans, or the Democratic Republican Party. They stood for the rights of the states and a strict reading of the Constitution. They wanted to focus on states' rights and the voice of the people. Being involved in an agrarian economy, Jefferson feared that Hamilton's policies would lead to a strong central government. He worried that the unlimited expansion of commerce and industry would produce a large caste of propertyless wage laborers dependent on others for their livelihood, and therefore subject to political manipulation and economic exploitation. The whole conflict between the two political parties can be boiled down to this. I want you to write this down because this is very important. Hamilton, the main focus of the Federalist Party, Hamilton feared anarchy and loved order. Jefferson feared tyranny and loved liberty. So Hamilton feared anything out of control, feared that if the government didn't have enough control, then it would dissolve into anarchy. So he erred on the side of let's control a little bit more. And Jefferson was always afraid of tyranny, always afraid of somebody coming in and exercising too much control over the people. And he loved the idea of personal liberty, that the people could make those decisions. So ask yourself, where do you stand? Which one of these two leaders do you think that you would have followed at the time? Washington was trying to mediate the party differences and hold the country together, but foreign problems began to abound. Originally, the French Revolution was viewed in the United States as an action similar to their own revolution of 1776. All that changed in 1792 when France declared war on Prussia and Austria and began to slaughter all of their nobility. This would cause problems in the United States because the Treaty of Alliance with France, signed in 1778 after the Battle of Saratoga, stated that the two countries were perpetual allies and were obligated to defend each other. Washington realized this promise would be problematic, and so his proclamation of 1793 declared that the United States was neutral in the European wars and that any citizen caught aiding them would be prosecuted. The French diplomat to the United States during the early days of the French Revolution was citizen Edmond Genet. Genet had begun hiring privateers to attack Spanish Florida and harass British ships. Washington worried that Genet's actions would lead to America's entrance into the war against England, which he did not want, and he demanded Genet's recall back to France. By the time the demand reached France, another revolution had swept out Genet's supporters, and he was ordered to be arrested, so he didn't want to go back to France. Genet begged for asylum to prevent being returned to France. In an effort to soothe relations with Great Britain because of the American raids on British ships, the Americans had been hired by the French, like I said before, to raid British ships. They really didn't want to anger Britain again. In an effort to soothe these relations, while also securing promises to pull British forts out of the Ohio River Valley, that had been part of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, that they were supposed to pull their forts out of the Ohio River, but the British didn't until after 1812. John Jay was sent to England to negotiate this treaty. His negotiations secured very few of Congress's demands, and his treaty, though offensive to many, was ratified to avoid further war with Britain. His terms included giving most favored nation status to Britain in exchange for Britain abandoning their American forts. It didn't work, as we'll talk about later. Domestically, the U.S. was still struggling with Indians along its western border. Washington sent General Mad Anthony Wayne into the Northwest Territory in 1793 to protect settlers from Native Americans, and there were many attacks at this time. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wayne's soldiers inflicted heavy casualties on Native American warriors, and then he burned their villages. The Indians had no other choice than to surrender their land in the Treaty of Greenville and then move farther west. The Indians, quote, sold their lands for $10,000 in exchange that they would leave without being followed. Citizens of the United States even rebelled against their own government. Alexander Hamilton levied a tax against whiskey in 1791, which angered the farmers for whom it was their principal crop. At the time, it was easier to move jugs of whiskey across the Appalachian Mountains than it was to move sheaves of wheat, so it was their principal trade. The farmers feared that this was another attempt to fleece the poor to subsidize the rich. Called the Whiskey Rebellion, events erupted in 1794 in western Pennsylvania, where federal revenue officers were being terrorized. Hoping to avoid another Shays Rebellion, Washington called out the militia, 13,000 men, and led by General Henry Lee. But by the time the troops got there, the rebels had vanished. A few were captured and marched in irons through Philadelphia. Violence against their own state and people was really not acceptable, but the rebellion had ended. Little, if any, blood was shed over the matter, but Washington's reaction was widely characterized as an overreaction. The Spanish did not recognize America's ownership of the southern border as laid out in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. They had kept the port city of New Orleans and all of Florida. In 1795, Thomas Pinckney secured the use of New Orleans as a port, and the land north of the 31st parallel, north of the Tennessee River, and west of the Mississippi became American territory. As you can see from this map, this was area that Pinckney's treaty secured for states that would later become Alabama and Mississippi. With the Land Act of 1796, Congress extended the rectangular surveys of land that had been accepted in 1785 and agreed to sell the land at $2 per acre, with 640 acres being the minimum sold. This was well beyond the means of most farmers. In 1800, the act was revised to a 320-acre minimum, and down payments were allowed so they didn't have to pay cash. The government was trying to make as much money as it could to finance some of its debt, but if the people couldn't pay the money, there was no way to generate the money, so they ended up lowering the price. Daniel Boone in 1795 continued to expand a Native American trail through the Cumberland Gap and opened what became known as the Wilderness Road. This allowed easier access to the backcountry, increasing the flow of goods and settlers into the area west of the Appalachians. That area would later become Kentucky and Tennessee. After serving 2 terms in office, President Washington was ready to retire. In his farewell address to the nation, he called for American citizens to forego political parties and to avoid entangling alliances with foreign nations. We'll read about this in the document booklet when we read Washington's farewell address. In all 3 presidential elections before 1804, the candidate with the second highest number of votes became the vice president, according to the Constitution. After the 800 election, this was no longer done. In the 1796 election, John Adams won the presidency and Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, even though they were of different parties. This caused a lot of contention between the two of them because they never really saw eye to eye on any political issue, and it ended with Jefferson actually walking out on Adams and refusing to meet with him because they differed so widely politically. By the time Adams came into office, the United States was in an undeclared war with France. Over 300 American ships had been plundered by French ships, and we'd broken off diplomatic relations with our former ally. In an effort to prevent a declared war, Adams sent a delegation to France to seek a diplomatic end. We were not prepared to go to war. This was less than 10 years after the Constitutional Convention. Nobody was ready to fight. They didn't have the military strength. They didn't have the Army or the Navy strength. So Adams was going to do everything he could to try to seek a diplomatic end to this dispute. Before the delegation was allowed to meet with their French counterparts, 3 French officials, whom Adams would name X, Y, and Z in his report to Congress, demanded a bribe before they would grant an audience with the U.S. diplomats. When this became known in America, it was granted with a cry of anger or war with France. French officials, realizing their mistake, eventually apologized. In response to the XYZ affair, Congress authorized the creation of a fleet of war vessels to fight the French, and this was the beginning of naval improvements. Before the advent of the Naval War, the Convention of 1800 released America from the Treaty of Alliance of 1778 with the French, which was signed during the Revolutionary War to boost the supplies and confidence of the Continental Army. But both sides, the Convention of 1800 and the United States released us from those obligations, citing that the French were almost declaring war on us as well. To counteract what was conceived as a Republican attempts to undermine his presidency, led by his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, who was always conspiring against him and trying to undermine him and gain control of Congress, John Adams signed several acts that constituted the greatest mistake of his presidency and thereby doomed his chance for re-election. These were the signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Already heated partisan politics had begun boiling over during the latter years of Washington's administration. The rhetoric grew so personal that opponents commonly resorted to duels, which we will discuss in class. John Adams became so paranoid and so worried about what was going on with his opponents, he signed into law the biggest mistakes of his presidency, which were the Alien and Sedition Acts. I want you to write down each of these 4 acts and what they mean. We will also be reading about these in our document booklet. So write down what each of these acts did. The Naturalization Act changed the time residency requirement for becoming a citizen from 5 to 14 years. So instead of living in the country for 5 years before you could apply for citizenship, you had to have lived here for 14 years. The Alien Act empowered the presidency with the ability to deport dangerous aliens. So the presidency got to decide who was dangerous, and generally it meant somebody who was dangerous to John Adams' presidency. The Alien Enemies Act allowed the country to expel enemy aliens at will during a time of war. So if you were living in the country and you were not a citizen, then you could be kicked out of the country during a time of war. The Sedition Act forbade citizens from writing, publishing, or speaking ill of the government or its officials. So the Sedition Act primarily limited the freedom of speech as guaranteed in the Bill of Rights under the First Amendment. Adams had always been very high-strung and he had been very volatile. Benjamin Franklin said that by succumbing to the partisan hysteria and acting their vindictive acts, Adams bore out what Benjamin Franklin had said about him years before. He said, "John Adams means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes and in some things absolutely out of his senses." He turned a little bit crazy and worried that everybody was out to get him there at the end, and that guaranteed that he would not be reelected as president in 1800, although he still did run. In the election of 1800, there were 4 men running for presidency: Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, John Adams, and Charles Pinckney. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr received the same number of electoral votes, and they were from the same political party, the Democratic Republicans. The House of Representatives took on the responsibility to break the tie, and there was a stalemate for 35 ballots. And then in the end, Jefferson finally won the vote when his arch enemy, Alexander Hamilton, advocated for electing Jefferson because Alexander Hamilton did not trust Aaron Burr because he was so quick to change his political affiliations just to get elected. So that's a quick summary of the Founders era, or the Federalist era. We're going to be talking about it in depth in class. We'll also be playing a game. Your notes will be checked in class, and you will be able to use those notes to play the game that we are going to do, which will involve a duel. So hopefully you took some good notes and you're ready to participate in our game in class on Wednesday. See you then.